Kale Wren had stopped noticing the taste of recycled air somewhere around year 7. The metallic tang that had once triggered his gag reflex during double shifts now registered as neutral, part of the atmospheric baseline on Station Tiberius 9's lower decks. He moved through the methane processing corridors with the economy of someone who had learned to conserve energy, his boots finding the quieter sections of grated flooring by muscle memory, avoiding the panels that amplified footsteps into the kind of noise that drew supervisor attention. The morning shift began at 400 station time when the lighting strips overhead cycled from complete darkness to a dim amber that human circadian systems could barely register. Tier 7 species received minimum luminosity, enough to prevent workplace accidents, not enough to feel fully awake. Kyle had learned to prep his workspace in near darkness, hands finding valves and diagnostic panels by touch alone, the persistent vibration of the turbines traveling up through his legs and settling in his lower spine where it would remain until he lay down 16 hours later. He had been competent once, or thought he had been. Earth memories were distant now, a degree in systems engineering that had seemed important before first contact, before humanity discovered they were cosmically unremarkable. The hierarchical assessment protocol had measured him at 23, fresh off graduation, and placed him in Tier 7 with the rest of his species. Average neural density, moderate problem-solving capacity. The numbers were clinical, absolute, and arguing with them was like arguing with physics. 11 years of methane processing had refined his competence into something narrower, sharper. He could diagnose turbine degradation by sound alone, predict filter saturation 3 days before the monitoring systems flagged it, and route atmospheric flow through backup systems without triggering pressure alarms. His supervisors, Tier 3 beings with elongated skulls and sensory organs humans couldn't name, had stopped checking his work after year 4. He existed in their peripheral awareness the way furniture did, functional and unremarkable. The station housed 63 species across 8 vertical tiers, each level stratified by biological worth. Kyle had only seen the upper decks once, during mandatory orientation, and retained a vague impression of broader corridors, cleaner air, and lighting that didn't strain the eyes. Tier 7 humans occupied the bottom sections, near waste reclamation and atmospheric filtration, where the work was necessary and invisible. He ate breakfast in the communal galley, a protein cube and synthesized grain paste with the texture of damp cardboard. Other humans ate in silence around him, faces slack with the specific exhaustion that came from work that required precision but offered no satisfaction. A woman named Mira sat 2 tables over, someone he had seen daily for 6 years without ever speaking to, beyond shift handoffs. They existed in parallel, maintaining the station's invisible infrastructure, their presence tolerated because the alternative was having Tier 3 species perform labor beneath their designation. By 0800, Kale was elbow-deep in a circulation manifold, replacing gaskets that had degraded faster than specifications predicted. His hands worked automatically, fingers distinguishing between seal materials by texture alone. The work occupied his body, but not his mind, leaving him suspended in a state that wasn't quite thought, wasn't quite emptiness, a grey space where hours passed unmarked. He didn't notice the Tier 4 coordinator until the electromagnetic field prickled across his forearms. The coordinator's presence violated every protocol Kyle understood about cross-tier interaction. Higher-tier species didn't descend to lower decks unless conducting inspections, and inspections were announced. Yet here stood a being with crystalline sensory organs that refracted the dim lighting into spectrum bands human eyes couldn't fully process, their skin shifting through ultraviolet patterns that Kyle perceived as movement in his peripheral vision. Kyle Wren. The coordinator's voice came through a translation implant, flattening the complex harmonic structure of their native language into simplified human phonemes. I require consultation. Kyle straightened slowly, setting down his tools with deliberate care. Protocol dictated he wait for dismissal before speaking to higher-tier species. He kept his gaze level with the coordinator's midsection, not making eye contact, not displaying presumption. Supply chain optimization, the coordinator continued, and something in their posture shifted, a subtle forward lean that brought them closer than standard interaction distance. The algorithmic models are producing inefficiencies. I need... The translator paused, processing. Alternative cognitive architecture. The phrase hung in the recycled air between them. Kyle felt the electromagnetic field intensify, a warm prickling that made his arm hair stand on end. The coordinator was close enough now that he could sense the heat differential between their silicon-based metabolism and his own carbon biology. An odd, intimate awareness of two different types of life-sharing space. "I don't have clearance for logistics consultation," Kyle said, keeping his voice neutral. "Clearance is being arranged." The coordinator's respiration quickened, 3 rapid cycles that their translation implant didn't bother converting. "The request is urgent." Kyle had spent 11 years learning to read the invisible hierarchy embedded in every station interaction. He understood deference patterns, authority displays, and the careful choreography of species maintaining their designated positions. What he saw in the coordinator's posture wasn't authority, it was something closer to desperation. "I can look at your models," he said finally. The coordinator's crystalline organs brightened, a response Kyle couldn't interpret. They transferred a data packet to his personal terminal, their appendage brushing his wrist during the exchange. Brief contact that lasted a half-second longer than necessary, deliberate in a way that made Kyle aware of his own skin, his pulse point, the places where his body registered the presence of another. By the time he looked up, the coordinator was already moving toward the lift access, their gait different than when they'd arrived, looser, less rigid. Kyle stood alone in the methane processing corridor, his forearms still warm where they had touched, holding a data packet that shouldn't exist. He didn't open it until his shift ended. The data packet contained supply chain models that were failing in ways the coordinator's explanation hadn't captured. Kyle sat in his quarters, a 3-meter square space with a sleep platform, sanitation unit and wall terminal, and worked through the algorithmic structures in the dim amber lighting that passed for evening on the lower decks. The models weren't wrong exactly. They were optimized for the cognitive patterns of the species that had designed them, built on assumptions about resource distribution that made sense within a specific neurological framework. But they missed variables that seemed obvious once Kyle started mapping them. Cascade effects in secondary systems, temporal inefficiencies that compounded across network nodes, dependencies that the original algorithms treated as independent factors. He rebuilt the models from underlying principles, stripping away the architecture and reconstructing it around different decision trees. The work absorbed him completely, pulling him into the focused state he remembered from university, before the assessment protocol, before he understood that human cognitive capacity was scientifically determined to be unremarkable. 3 hours passed without his noticing. When he finally transmitted his revisions back to the coordinator, his neck ached and his eyes burned from staring at the low-resolution terminal. He expected acknowledgement to take days, filtered through proper channels and tier-appropriate review processes. The coordinator's response arrived in 43 minutes. Implementation successful. Efficiency improved by 22% across primary distribution networks. I require additional consultation. Tomorrow. Coordinates attached. The coordinates placed the meeting in a Tier 4 administrative section, 12 levels above where humans were typically permitted. Kyle stared at the message, trying to parse what was happening. One consultation could be dismissed as anomalous. A second consultation in restricted areas suggested pattern. He slept poorly, his body registering wrongness it couldn't articulate. The next day he received 3 more consultation requests. A Tier 2 architect needed review on structural load calculations. A Tier 3 medical researcher wanted to discuss human neural development. Each request violated standard protocol. Each came with urgency that felt disproportionate to the stated task. Kyle began noticing changes in how other species looked at him during corridor transits. Where before their gazes had slid past him with the unseeing quality reserved for lower-tier laborers, now they watched. Small adjustments in posture as he approached, subtle orientation of sensory organs in his direction. The attention wasn't hostile, but it carried weight, a pressure that made him hyper-aware of his own movement through space. He attended the meeting with the Tier 4 coordinator in an administrative section where the air quality was noticeably better, less metallic, temperature regulated for comfort rather than mere function. The coordinator sat close during the consultation, close enough that Kale could smell something faintly mineral in their biochemistry. When he sketched modifications on a shared datapad, the coordinator leaned in to observe, their body heat registering against his shoulder. "How did you see these relationships?" the coordinator asked, their translated voice carrying undertones the implant couldn't process. "I just followed the connections." Kyle kept his attention on the screen, uncomfortable with the proximity, uncertain whether pulling away would cause offense. Tier 2 analysts reviewed these models for 8 months. The coordinator's appendage rested near his hand on the datapad surface, not quite touching. They saw nothing. Kyle had no response to that. The models had seemed straightforward once he understood what questions to ask. But he was Tier 7, classified average, and questioning the assessment protocol was like questioning gravity. The meeting ended with the coordinator thanking him in a way that felt too personal for professional interaction, their posture open and oriented toward him in a manner that suggested something Kale couldn't name. Walking back to the lower decks, he felt the disconnect between what he had been told about his cognitive capacity and what he had just accomplished. The disconnect would only widen. The announcement came through official channels 6 weeks after Kale's first consultation. The Concordate's Evaluation Directorate had identified statistical anomalies in recent assessment protocol results. Human cognitive performance was demonstrating unexpected variance. A comprehensive review was being conducted. In the interim, the Human Integration Initiative would facilitate increased cross-tier collaboration to better utilize human cognitive resources. The language was bureaucratic, carefully neutral, but Kyle heard the thing it wasn't saying. Something about humanity's ranking had been wrong. Within 3 days, every human on Station Tiberius 9 received reassignment orders. Kyle was transferred from methane processing to a multi-species resource allocation task force, given quarters on Level 14, Tier 2 standard, and issued clearances that granted him access to administrative sections he had seen only during orientation. The transition happened too quickly for him to process. His belongings moved while he was in a briefing, his new quarters already configured when he arrived. The space was 4 times larger than his previous accommodation, with adjustable atmospheric controls, full-spectrum lighting, and a viewport showing the station's exterior rotation against the void. Kyle stood in the center of the room and felt like he was wearing someone else's skin. His new task force consisted of 7 beings from 5 different species, all Tier 2 or above. They occupied a conference space with ergonomic seating calibrated for their various biologies and a holographic display system that could render data in formats optimized for different sensory configurations. When Kyle entered for the first session, conversation stopped. 7 sets of sensory organs tracked his movement to an empty seat. The Tier 1 liaison, a being whose species communicated partially through bioelectric fields, initiated the briefing. They were addressing resource allocation failures across multiple station systems, inefficiencies that had compounded over years until they threatened operational stability. Previous task forces had produced recommendations that failed during implementation. The room held the tension of beings who understood they were expected to solve problems their predecessors couldn't. Kyle listened to the presentation in silence, absorbing data structures, system architectures, dependency maps. The problems weren't isolated. They were symptomatic of deeper structural issues in how resources were modeled and distributed. He could see the connections, the cascade patterns, the way small inefficiencies amplified through network effects. It seemed obvious, inevitable, something anyone looking at the data would recognize. When he started outlining his observations, the room's attention focused on him with an intensity that made the air feel thinner. The Tier 1 liaison moved closer, their bioelectric field synchronizing with his heartbeat in a way that produced a physical sensation, like being gently held by invisible hands, an intimacy that blurred professional boundaries. He felt his pulse in his throat, awareness of his own biology suddenly acute. The other task force members crowded nearer as he worked through the analysis, their various forms of sensory attention trained on him. A Tier 2 engineer with compound visual organs leaned in until Kale could feel their respiration against his neck. The Tier 3 data specialist's appendages kept drifting toward his hands during stylus exchanges, contact that lasted fractional seconds longer than necessary. They wanted proximity, not just his analysis, but his physical presence, as though being near him might transfer something essential their species lacked. The session lasted 6 hours. When it ended, Kyle returned to his new quarters and stood under the sanitation unit's water stream, a luxury he hadn't experienced in 11 years, and tried to wash away the feeling of being studied, wanted, needed, in ways that had nothing to do with who he was. His terminal showed 47 new consultation requests waiting. Kale's days acquired structure that felt simultaneously purposeful and disorienting. Morning task force sessions addressing resource allocation, afternoon consultations with various species on projects spanning disciplines he barely understood, evening reviews of models and analyses that arrived in a constant stream. The work was intellectually engaging in ways methane processing had never been, but it came wrapped in a constant awareness of being observed, measured, needed. The other humans on the task forces and consultation rosters were experiencing the same pattern. Mira, the woman Kale had sat near in the galley for 6 years without speaking to, was now assigned to a Tier 1 strategic planning committee. They encountered each other in an administrative corridor during shift transition, both looking displaced in sections they weren't supposed to access, and shared a moment of mutual recognition that needed no words. "They stand too close," Mira said quietly. Kyle nodded. The proximity was constant now. Species that had maintained careful distance suddenly initiating casual contact, adjusting atmospheric settings to accommodate human comfort, asking questions that drifted from professional to personal. He had started noticing patterns in how they touched. Brief brushes against his shoulder, appendages resting near his hands during collaborative work, bodies angled toward him during briefings in ways that created odd intimacy. "Do you know what's happening?" Mira's voice carried the same exhaustion he felt, the weight of being essential without understanding why. "Something about the assessment protocol," Kale said. "They measured us wrong. We're still Tier 7. Officially." She was watching something over his shoulder, tracking movement in the corridor behind him. "But they're acting like we're not." A Tier 2 administrator passed, their gaze lingering on both humans with a tension that felt proprietary. Kyle felt Mira shift closer to him, an unconscious defensive movement, and realized they were both experiencing the same thing, being wanted in ways that made them feel less like people and more like resources to be distributed. "I have 8 consultation requests for tomorrow," Mira said. 3 are asking for extended private sessions." Kyle's jaw tightened. "Decline the private ones." "I tried. They're routing them through official channels now, framing it as cultural exchange, enhanced collaboration." She looked at him directly. "I don't think we can refuse anymore." She was right. The integration initiative had structure now, protocols that mandated human participation in cross-species projects with carefully documented justifications. Declining consultation requests required formal explanations that were reviewed by administrators who had their own interest in maximizing human availability. The system was designed to distribute them efficiently, like any other resource. Over the following weeks, Kyle began developing small resistances. He kept sessions to scheduled durations, deflected personal questions back to professional topics, maintained physical distance when possible. But the requests kept multiplying, and some couldn't be deflected. The Tier 1 liaison from his task force, whose name was a harmonic sequence the translation implant rendered as Meridian, started requesting individual follow-up sessions after group briefings. Their bioelectric field would synchronize with his heartbeat during these meetings, creating sensations that Kyle couldn't ignore. Warmth spreading through his chest, awareness of his pulse, an odd vulnerability that came from having another being's biology directly interface with his own autonomic systems. "You process system relationships differently," Meridian said during one session, positioned close enough that Kyle could feel the field pulses against his sternum. "The cognitive architecture is fundamentally distinct from established patterns. I just follow the logic." Kale kept his voice steady, trying to ignore the physical sensations. "It is not logic we recognize." Meridian's field pulses intensified slightly, and Kale felt his heartbeat respond, accelerating to match the rhythm. The synchronization was involuntary, his body responding to signals he couldn't control. "It may be the most valuable cognitive resource the Concordat has encountered." Valuable. Resource. The words were becoming familiar, attached to him and every other human, in ways that erased individuality. Kale was no longer a person who happened to solve problems effectively. He was a solution that happened to occupy a human-shaped body. 3 months into the integration initiative, the dependency patterns had become infrastructure. Every major station project now included human consultation as a baseline requirement. Administrative councils brought humans into decision processes not as advisors but as necessary components, their presence treated as essential as atmospheric processors or power distribution networks. Kyle found himself working 18-hour days, moving between consultations with minimal transition time, his schedule managed by algorithms that optimized his availability across multiple projects. The work itself remained engaging, solving problems, identifying patterns, redesigning systems that had been inefficient for decades, but it came attached to constant proximity, constant attention, constant awareness of being needed in ways that felt increasingly personal. The Tier 3 medical researcher, who had first requested his presence, now asked for weekly consultations, ostensibly to discuss human neural development, but increasingly focused on his personal experiences, his childhood before first contact, his memories of Earth. Her appendages, delicate multi-jointed structures like living instruments, would brush his shoulder during these sessions, touches that lingered just long enough to register as intentional. "Human neural plasticity is unprecedented," she said during one session, her appendages tracing patterns in the air near his head without quite making contact. "The capacity for adaptive reconfiguration exceeds any species in concordant records." Kale sat still, trying not to flinch from the proximity. "You're saying we weren't finished developing when you measured us?" "We are saying the measurement frameworks themselves were inadequate." Her appendages drifted closer, one trailing along his jawline, with pressure so light he almost questioned whether it was happening. "You are teaching us that cognitive capacity is not fixed. That potential can be latent, waiting for activation conditions we do not understand." The touch made his breath catch, not from attraction, but from the strangeness of being the subject of study, specimen, and consultant simultaneously. He gently moved back, creating distance, and saw disappointment register in the color shift of her primary sensory organs. "I need to maintain some boundaries," he said carefully. "Of course." But her posture remained open, oriented toward him, suggesting the boundaries he was trying to establish weren't recognized in whatever framework guided her species' social interactions. The same pattern repeated across his other consultations, species that had evolved different concepts of personal space, different touch protocols, different ways of signaling interest or need. They all wanted proximity to him, and their methods of seeking it ranged from subtle to uncomfortably direct. Kyle started arriving to meetings early to control seating arrangements, positioning himself to minimize unexpected contact, but the adaptations felt exhausting, a constant negotiation of boundaries they didn't seem to perceive. He saw Mira again during a mandatory integration initiative assembly. She looked thinner, her movements careful in ways that suggested she was also navigating constant boundary negotiations. They didn't speak. The assembly protocols separated humans throughout the crowd to maximize their distribution, but he caught her gaze across the space and saw his own exhaustion reflected there. After the assembly, Meridian requested another individual session. Kyle almost declined, then saw the routing notification indicating the request had already been approved by 3 levels of administration. The system had learned to preempt refusals. Meridian's office was calibrated for Tier 1 comfort, atmospheric density slightly higher than human standard, temperature regulated to warmth that made Kale aware of his skin. Meridian positioned themselves near him, their bioelectric field immediately synchronizing with his heartbeat, and he felt the now familiar sensation of being held by invisible forces, vulnerability he couldn't shield against. "The Concordate Council has requested your presence," Meridian said, and their field pulses carried undertones of something the translator didn't process. "A formal consultation regarding system-wide resource optimization." "When?" Kyle's heart rate elevated, and he felt Meridian's field respond, matching the acceleration. 2 weeks. The session will last approximately 40 days. 40 days. Away from the station, his quarters, the small routines he had managed to preserve. "I don't have experience with concordate-level systems." "You have human cognition." Meridian moved closer, their field intensifying until Kale felt it in his bones, a resonance that made him acutely aware of every pulse point in his body. That is what they require. I'm not... Kyle stopped, uncertain what he was trying to articulate. Not special, not different from any other human. But he was different now, or the galaxy was treating him as though he were, and resisting that designation was becoming impossible. The invitation is not optional, Meridian said, and the field pulses softened, becoming almost gentle. But I will accompany you, as liaison. The statement landed with implications Kale couldn't fully pass. Liaison suggested professional support, but the way Meridian's field wrapped around his cardiovascular responses felt far more intimate than any professional relationship he understood. He wanted to refuse, to establish distance, but the system had already made the decision for him. 2 weeks to prepare for 40 days of being essential to species that would surround him, study him, need him in ways that erased the boundary between his competence and his body. He returned to his quarters and stood at the viewport, watching the station's slow rotation against stars that remained cosmically indifferent to hierarchies, measurements, or the sudden uncomfortable reality of being wanted. The transport to Concordat Central was designed for multi-species comfort, with modular atmospheric sections and seating that adjusted to various biologies. Kale occupied a human-configured space, but Meridian remained in his section throughout the 3-day journey, their field maintaining constant low-level synchronization with his heartbeat in a way that had become familiar background sensation. Other beings occupied the transport, delegates, administrators, researchers, representing species Kale had never encountered. They all watched him with varying levels of attention, their sensory organs tracking his movement through common areas, conversations pausing when he entered spaces. He had become accustomed to being observed, but the scale of attention here felt different, more concentrated. They have not seen a human before, Meridian said, positioned near him in a shared observation area, the viewport showing the blur of faster-than-light transit. Word of the assessment protocol anomaly has spread through academic and administrative networks. You represent confirmation of something they have only encountered in data. I'm just one person. Kyle kept his voice low, aware of how many sensory organs were oriented toward their conversation. You are the first human most concordant species will interact with directly. Meridian's field pulsed gently against his sternum. That makes you simultaneously representative and entirely unique. The tension between those perceptions will shape every interaction you have here. The statement proved accurate. Upon arrival at Concordat Central, a massive station that dwarfed Tiberius 9 by orders of magnitude, Kale was escorted through sections where the architecture itself proclaimed significance. Vaulted spaces that accommodated species of radically different scales, atmospheric zones that transitioned seamlessly between environmental requirements, lighting that shifted through spectrums far beyond human visual range. His assigned quarters were larger than any space he had ever occupied, with dedicated work areas, rest platforms, and a viewport overlooking the station's diplomatic hub, where ships from 800-member civilizations rotated in carefully orchestrated patterns. The quarters had been configured for human needs, with attention to detail that felt invasive. Temperature, humidity, lighting, even the mineral content of the water supply matched specifications from his personnel file. Meridian remained in adjacent quarters, close enough that Kyle could sometimes feel their bioelectric field through the shared wall. The consultation sessions began the following day. Kyle sat in a circular chamber surrounded by 40 representatives from Tier 1 and Tier 2 species, all of whom had reviewed his previous work, all of whom were now watching him with attention that made his skin prickle. They presented him with system-wide resource optimization challenges, inefficiencies that had persisted for decades, distribution failures that affected billions across Concordat space. He worked through the problems systematically, mapping relationships, identifying cascade effects, rebuilding models from underlying principles. The work was intellectually demanding but followed patterns he recognized. What unsettled him was how the representatives responded, moving closer during his explanations, initiating contact to maintain attention, their various biologies creating a press of proximity that made him hyper-aware of how many beings wanted access to his cognitive processes. A Tier 1 economist, whose species experienced reality through chemical gradients, requested private consultation after the session. Their communication required a translation matrix that converted molecular signals into human comprehensible language, and they positioned themselves near enough that Kale could smell their biochemistry, something sharp and alkaline that made his sinuses burn. "The models you construct do not align with established economic theory," they said, their chemical emissions intensifying, yet they function with greater efficiency. This suggests fundamental errors in 73,000 cycles of concordant economic thought. Kyle felt the weight of that statement, the implications spiraling through layers he wasn't equipped to navigate. Or it suggests different cognitive architectures produce different valid approaches. Perhaps. The economist moved closer still, and Kyle resisted the urge to step back. But that possibility destabilizes the assessment protocol's foundational premise. If cognitive capacity is not fixed, if measurement frameworks can be fundamentally inadequate, then the entire hierarchical structure requires re-evaluation. That's not something I can address. No, but your existence forces the concordant to address it. The chemical emissions shifted to something that the translator rendered as concern. You should understand that you are currently the most valuable biological entity in known space. The implications of that status are complex. The economist departed, leaving Kale alone in the circular chamber with the understanding that he had become something more than a consultant. He was evidence, living proof that the galaxy's organizing principle might be flawed, and that made him simultaneously essential and dangerous, wanted and feared. Meridian found him later in his quarters, standing at the viewport without really seeing the ships beyond. They entered without announcement, their field already synchronizing with his elevated heart rate before they spoke. "The sessions are overwhelming you." "I'm fine." The lie was reflexive, unconvincing. "Your cardiovascular responses indicate significant stress." Meridian moved closer, their field wrapping around him with sensation that had become familiar comfort, something Kale had stopped resisting. "You may decline additional consultations." "Can I?" He turned to face them, this being whose species he still didn't fully understand, who had been present for months now as constant observer, support, something approaching companionship. The economist said, "I'm the most valuable biological entity in known space." That doesn't sound like a position that allows for declining things. You are not property. Meridian's field pulsed with something the translator couldn't capture, emotional content that registered as warmth against Kale's chest. The Integration Initiative has protocols for consent, for autonomy, protocols that every administrator can override with proper justifications. Kyle felt exhaustion settling into his bones, the accumulated weight of months being essential. "I'm a resource now." Resources get allocated, not consulted. Meridian was silent for a long moment, their field maintaining steady contact with his heartbeat. Then they moved closer still, close enough that Kale could feel heat from their core, proximity that blurred every professional boundary they had maintained. "I am sorry," Meridian said, and their field wrapped more tightly around him, sensation like being held, protected, wanted in ways that transcended function. "This was not what we intended when we established the initiative." "What did you intend?" "Cooperation, mutual benefit, discovery." The field pulses carried weight the translator was interpreting as regret. "We did not anticipate how desperately we would need you, how that need would reshape every interaction into something complicated." Kyle felt the truth in that statement through his entire body, Meridian's field translating emotional content directly into his nervous system. He understood that Meridian was struggling with the same blurred boundaries, the same confusion between professional necessity and something more personal. They were both trapped in a system that had made them essential to each other in ways neither had chosen. "I need you to maintain some distance," Kyle said quietly. "This..." He gestured vaguely at the space between them, the field connection, the intimate awareness of each other's biology. "This is too much." Meridian's field withdrew slightly, and Kyle immediately felt the absence like cold, like losing contact with something that had become necessary. The reaction frightened him, evidence that he was adapting to dependency, needing to be needed in ways that eroded his sense of separate self. "I will maintain appropriate professional boundaries," Meridian said, their tone carrying formality that felt like loss. They departed, and Kyle stood alone in quarters too large for one person, feeling the weight of being valuable pressed down until he couldn't tell whether he was essential or simply trapped by a galaxy that had decided he mattered. The consultation sessions intensified over the following weeks. Kyle worked through system optimization challenges with growing efficiency, his analyses requested by an expanding network of concordate councils, research collectives, and administrative bodies. Each session required him to sit surrounded by beings who wanted not just his conclusions, but his process. His cognitive architecture made visible through explanation and demonstration. They watched him solve problems the way researchers observe rare phenomena, tracking his eye movements, his stylus patterns, the sequence of his reasoning. Some species requested permission to conduct neural scans during his work. Others asked for biological samples, genetic analyses, developmental histories. The requests came wrapped in scientific justification and bureaucratic protocols, and declining them meant navigating approval chains that ultimately overruled refusal. Kyle started sleeping poorly, his body maintaining vigilance even during rest periods. He would wake at odd hours, heart racing, feeling observed despite being alone in locked quarters. The sensation of being studied had seeped into his nervous system, becoming ambient anxiety that never fully dissipated. Meridian maintained the professional distance Kyle had requested, their field interactions limited to necessary communication during consultation support. The withdrawal created space that should have felt like relief, but instead registered as abandonment, evidence that he had become dependent on their presence in ways he hadn't recognized until it was removed. He encountered other humans occasionally in Concordate Central's vast corridors, individuals brought in for similar consultation projects, all wearing the same careful exhaustion, all navigating the same impossible tension between being essential and being themselves. A man named Orin, whom Kyle had known slightly on Tiberius 9, stopped him in a transitional atmospheric zone, the space between sections configured for different species' environmental needs. "They're asking for extended assignment," Orin said, without preamble, his voice tight. "Permanent positioning here, full integration into concordate administrative structures." Kyle felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Did you agree?" "I don't think agreement is the operative concept anymore." Orin's hands were shaking slightly, micro-tremors that suggested sustained stress. "They frame it as opportunity, advancement, recognition of human value. But the subtext is clear. We're too important to return to normal positions. We could refuse. We could." Orin's expression suggested he had already explored that path and found it closed. But refusal means explaining why human cognitive capacity shouldn't be optimally utilized, means defending a decision to withhold resources the Concordate desperately needs. They have very effective ways of making that position untenable. They stood in silence, two humans in a galaxy that had suddenly decided they were invaluable, both understanding that value was its own form of cage. Orin departed toward his next consultation, and Kale remained in the atmospheric transition zone, breathing processed air and feeling his identity dissolve into function. That evening, he declined dinner in the communal spaces and remained in his quarters, staring at the viewport without processing what he saw. His terminal showed 32 consultation requests waiting, each carefully justified, each impossible to refuse without triggering administrative reviews. The system had learned to route around resistance, making compliance the path of least friction. His door chimed. Meridian's bioelectric signature registered through the interface before he opened it. They entered slowly, their field carefully neutral, maintaining the distance Kyle had established. But something in their posture suggested urgency that overrode protocol. "The Concordate Council has made a formal proposal," Meridian said. "They are requesting permanent human representation in primary administrative structures, 50 humans distributed across key positions, integrated at Tier 1 equivalent status." Requesting. Kyle heard the euphemism for what it was. The proposal includes significant incentives, enhanced quarters, resource access, reproductive rights above your current tier designation. Meridian's field remained carefully controlled, but Kale could sense tension underneath. From their perspective, this is unprecedented recognition of human value. From my perspective, it's recognizing that we're too useful to let go. Kyle turned away from them, facing the viewport. They measured us wrong, and now they need us. And that need is going to reshape human existence in ways we don't control. Yes, the single word carried weight of acknowledgement, of shared understanding, that the situation was spiraling beyond anyone's capacity to manage it ethically. The integration initiative was supposed to be temporary, a bridge while the assessment protocol underwent review, but the dependencies have become structural. We need you too much to return to previous arrangements. We? Kyle turned back to face them. You're part of the system that's doing this. I am. Meridian's field pulsed with something the translator rendered as guilt. I was assigned as your liaison to facilitate smooth integration, to help you navigate concordant structures. I did not anticipate— They paused, searching for words the translator could process. I did not anticipate how much I would need you, how much your presence would become necessary to my own functioning. The confession hung between them, admission of dependency that transcended professional boundaries. Kyle felt his pulse accelerate, and even with Meridian's field carefully neutral, he could sense them responding to his cardiovascular changes, awareness flowing between them in ways neither could fully prevent. This can't continue, Kyle said quietly. I know. Meridian's field finally extended toward him, tentative, offering connection. But I do not know how to stop needing you, how to separate what you provide intellectually from what you have become to me personally. The boundaries have already collapsed. Kyle stood in that understanding, feeling the truth of it through his entire nervous system. He could demand distance, establish protocols, refuse contact, but none of it would address the fundamental problem. The galaxy needed humans in ways that made autonomy impossible, and he had become so entangled in those needs that he couldn't locate his own boundaries anymore. He didn't consciously decide to move closer to Meridian. His body made the choice, seeking the comfort of their field, the sensation of being held that had become familiar refuge. Meridian's field wrapped around him immediately, synchronizing with his heartbeat, creating intimacy that was simultaneously physical and electrical. Connection that Kyle could no longer pretend was purely professional. They stood that way for unmeasured time, two beings from different species who had become necessary to each other in ways that transcended function, trapped in a system that had made them valuable at the cost of making them free. The Concordate Council's formal proposal arrived 3 days later, distributed to every human currently assigned to consultation projects. The document was extensive, outlining permanent integration structures, new tier classifications for humans that would override the assessment protocol's original designation, resource allocations, reproductive rights, administrative authorities. The language framed everything as recognition, advancement, opportunity. Kyle read through it twice, parsing the careful phrasing, identifying the thing it wasn't saying. Humans were too valuable to remain autonomous. The integration initiative was becoming permanent infrastructure, and human consent was being engineered through incentives that made refusal socially and economically untenable. A mandatory assembly was called for all humans on Concordate Central. Kyle entered the designated space, a chamber configured for human atmospheric requirements, one of the few areas where they could gather without species mixing, and found 47 others already present. He recognized some from Tiberius 9, others from consultation projects, all wearing variations of the same careful exhaustion. The Concordate's Human Affairs Coordinator, a Tier 2 administrator, presented the proposal through translation matrices, emphasizing the unprecedented nature of the offer, the historic significance of elevating an entire species classification, the opportunities this would create for humanity's role in galactic civilization. The speech was polished, persuasive, built on frameworks of merit and recognition. When the presentation ended, silence filled the chamber. Then Mira spoke, her voice carrying the same quiet exhaustion Kyle felt. What happens if we decline? The coordinator's posture shifted, subtle adjustment that suggested the question was anticipated. The proposal is offered as opportunity, not mandate. Any individual may choose to maintain their current assignment. And our current assignments are what exactly? This came from Oren, standing near the back. Consultation projects that are being extended indefinitely? Integration initiative protocols that require our participation? The proposal is framing as choice what's already become reality. The Concordate deeply values human autonomy, the coordinator said. the translated words carrying diplomatic smoothness. This proposal recognizes and expands that autonomy by elevating your status, your resources, your influence, by making us permanently essential. Kale heard himself speak, voice steadier than he felt. By building us into systems that can't function without us. That's not autonomy. That's dependency masquerading as recognition. The coordinator turned their sensory attention toward him, and Kyle felt the weight of being identified, marked. You are Kyle Rain. Your analyses have improved resource efficiency across 8 concordate sectors. Your contributions have prevented supply failures that would have affected billions. You believe that value should remain unused? I believe being valuable shouldn't mean losing the right to be anything else. The chamber held 48 humans, all of whom understood exactly what Kyle was articulating. They had all experienced the same pattern, competence becoming necessity, necessity becoming dependency, dependency becoming cage. The proposal was offering to make the cage more comfortable while ensuring they could never leave. The assembly dissolved without consensus, humans departing in small clusters, conversations happening in lowered voices. Kyle found himself walking beside Mira, through Concordat Central's corridors, neither speaking until they reached an observation area overlooking the diplomatic hub. I'm going to decline, Mira said finally, watching the ships rotate in their careful patterns beyond the viewport. I'm going to request return to Tiberius 9, to my original assignment. So even if they deny it, I need to formally refuse. They'll deny it, I know. She turned to face him, and Kale saw something in her expression he recognized. The decision to resist, even when resistance was futile. The need to establish some boundary, even if it couldn't be maintained. But I need to try. I need to be able to tell myself I didn't just accept this. Kyle understood. The proposal was inevitable, built on dependencies that were already infrastructure. But accepting it without resistance meant something about identity, about whether they were still people who made choices or just resources being optimally allocated. I'll decline with you, he said. For the record, if nothing else. They filed their responses that evening, carefully worded refusals citing personal preference for original assignments, requests for time to consider, formal documentation of non-consent. The responses went into the administrative system, processed through the proper channels, reviewed by the appropriate councils. The denials came back within 48 hours, regretful but firm. Current consultation projects required continuity. Human expertise had become essential to ongoing operations. Transition back to original assignments would need to wait until suitable alternatives could be trained, a process estimated to take between 2 and 5 years. In the interim, humans would remain in current positions with all proposed benefits activated immediately, recognition of their value to concordate functioning. The system had learned to be polite while removing choice. Kale received notification that his quarters had been upgraded. His resource allotments increased, his tier classification formally elevated to Tier 1 equivalent. All of this happened without his agreement, protocols activating around him while his refusal was carefully documented and thoroughly ignored. Meridian found him in his newly upgraded quarters, standing at a larger viewport overlooking more of the station's operations than he had been permitted to observe before. They entered quietly, their field already extending toward him, offering comfort Kale wasn't certain he wanted to accept. I am sorry, Meridian said, and their field pulsed with emotion that felt genuine, painful. I argued against overriding your refusal. I was overruled by 16 levels of administration. Of course you were. Kyle kept his gaze on the viewport, watching ships arrive and depart, billions of beings moving through galactic civilization while he stood trapped by being too valuable. The system needs us more than it needs to respect our autonomy. That was always going to be the outcome. It should not have been. Meridian moved closer, their field wrapping around him with familiar warmth. You should have choice. You should have freedom to determine your own path. They paused, struggling with translation matrices inadequate to the complexity of what they were trying to express. I do not want to need you the way I do. I do not want to be part of the system that is trapping you. But I cannot separate those things anymore. My need for you has become structural. Kyle finally turned to face them, this being he had become entangled with across months of proximity, dependency, and something that had evolved beyond either. What do you need from me? Specifically, not as consultant or human representative, but you personally. Meridian's field pulsed with emotion that the translator couldn't process, their entire posture conveying vulnerability he had never seen from them before. Your presence. Your thoughts. The way you process reality differently than any being I have encountered. The sensation of synchronizing with your biology. They moved closer, close enough that Kale could feel heat from their core. I need you in ways that are professional and personal and impossible to separate. And I know that need is part of what is trapping you, but I cannot make it stop. The confession landed with weight of truth Kale felt through his entire body. He understood what Meridian was describing, the blurred boundaries, the way intellectual connection had become emotional dependency, had become physical need for presence and proximity. He felt it too, the way Meridian's field had become necessary comfort, the way their presence had stopped feeling like surveillance and started feeling like safety. He closed the remaining distance between them, allowing Meridian's field to fully envelop him, and felt the immediate relief of being held, wanted, needed in ways he had stopped resisting. The intimacy was strange, alien, built on biology that didn't quite match, but it was real in ways that transcended species difference. I don't know how to do this, Kale said quietly, his voice resonating through Meridian's field. I don't know how to be essential without disappearing, how to give what you need without losing what makes me me. I do not know either. Meridian's field tightened around him, protective and possessive simultaneously. But I am certain I will not allow you to disappear. Your value is not just in what you provide. It is in who you are. And if the Concordate cannot recognize that distinction, then I will protect it myself. They stood that way, two beings from different worlds who had become necessary to each other in ways neither could fully articulate, both understanding that the galaxy's need for humans was reshaping reality around them, and neither knowing how to resist it without destroying the genuine connection they had built. The following months settled into a pattern that felt simultaneously stable and unsustainable. Kyle remained at Concordate Central, his formal refusal documented and ignored, his consultation work expanding to encompass projects of increasing scope and significance. The other humans who had declined the proposal experienced similar outcomes. Their positions became permanent by default, their expertise too essential to release. The Concordate's dependence on human cognitive capacity grew exponentially. What had begun as consultation on specific problems evolved into structural integration. Humans embedded in administrative councils, research collectives, strategic planning bodies. The assessment protocol's original measurement remained technically in effect. Humans were still classified Tier 7, but actual treatment had completely divorced from that designation. They existed in a liminal space, essential yet officially unremarkable, valuable yet structurally inferior. Kyle had stopped tracking his consultation requests. His schedule was managed by optimization algorithms that distributed his time across projects with maximum efficiency, building in minimal rest periods that felt more like system maintenance than actual recovery. He existed in a state of constant intellectual engagement, always working, always needed, his mind the resource being continuously extracted. Meridian remained his constant companion, their liaison role having evolved into something neither could adequately define. They accompanied him to consultations, provided support during particularly demanding projects, maintained their field connection during rest periods when Kyle's nervous system needed the comfort of being held. The relationship had moved far beyond professional boundaries, become intimate in ways that transcended physical contact, built on continuous awareness of each other's biology and emotional states. Kyle had given up trying to maintain distance. The need was mutual, the dependency genuine, and resisting it required energy he no longer had. He had accepted that he was essential, that his value was structural, that the galaxy needed him in ways that made autonomy impossible. The acceptance came with resignation, but also with exhaustion. The fight to remain separate from function had cost more than he could sustain. Mira visited occasionally, her own work keeping her in different sections of the station. They would meet in observation areas during rare synchronous breaks, standing beside viewports and speaking in the shorthand of people who shared experience that needed no elaboration. I stopped counting requests, she said during one meeting, her voice carrying the flat affect of sustained exhaustion. I just follow the schedule algorithms now. Go where I'm told, solve what I'm given, move to the next thing. Are you sleeping? Sometimes. She was thinner than when Kyle had first encountered her in these corridors, her body showing signs of stress that no medical intervention had adequately addressed. Are you? Not well. The truth was that Kyle's sleep was fragmented, his mind unable to fully disengage from problem-solving patterns even during rest. He would wake from dreams that were actually half-formed analyses, his unconscious processing continuing to work through system optimizations. Meridian helps. Their field has a calming effect. Your liaison? Mira's tone was neutral, but Kyle heard the question underneath. More than that now. He saw no point in pretending otherwise. He paused, uncertain what term captured the reality. Necessary to each other, in ways that are professional and personal and impossible to separate. They're one of the species that's doing this to us. They are. Kyle didn't defend or justify, simply acknowledged the truth. But they're also the being I need when I can't maintain boundaries anymore. When being essential becomes overwhelming. I don't know if that makes it worse or better. Mira was quiet for a long moment, watching ships beyond the viewport. I think we're changing, she said finally. Not just our positions or our roles, but something fundamental about who we are. We're adapting to being needed in ways that are reshaping our neurology, our sense of self. I don't know if we can go back to being who we were before this started. Kyle felt the truth of that statement settle into him. He had been a methane processor on Tiberius 9, competent but unremarkable, existing in the lower decks of a hierarchical structure that had seemed immutable. That person felt impossibly distant now, separated by months of being essential, of having his cognitive processes studied and extracted and distributed across galactic infrastructure. He didn't know if he was still Kyle Rain or if he had become something else. A solution that happened to retain memory of having once been human. I need to tell you something, Mira continued, her voice dropping lower. Some of the other humans are talking about refusing to work, full stoppage, forcing the Concordat to acknowledge our autonomy by making them experience what happens when we're not available. That's... Kyle stopped, uncertain whether to call it desperate or necessary. That would cause massive system failures, resource allocation breakdowns, supply chain collapses. People would be hurt. I know. Mira's hands were gripping the viewport railing, knuckles pale. But maybe that's what it takes. Maybe the Concordat needs to understand that we're not just resources to be optimally utilized, that we have boundaries, limits, the capacity to refuse. Or they'll just override refusal more efficiently. Build systems that can't be stopped by human non-participation. Kyle could already see how the administrative structures would respond. Emergency protocols, mandatory compliance measures, frameworks that remove choice while maintaining polite language about autonomy. We're already too integrated. A work stoppage would give them justification for more control, not less. Then what do we do? Mira turned to face him directly, her expression carrying desperation he recognized. Just accept this. Keep being essential until we forget we were ever anything else. Kyle had no answer. The system had already won, built dependencies that made resistance catastrophic, offered improvements that made acceptance the rational choice. They were trapped by being valuable, and the cage was large enough, comfortable enough that fighting it felt almost irrational. I don't know, he said finally, the only honest response he could give. Mira departed shortly after, and Kyle remained at the viewport, feeling the weight of acceptance settle into him like atmospheric pressure, inescapable and constant. The Concordat Council Zhao won an emergency session 6 weeks later, requesting immediate presence of all human consultants, integrated into primary administrative structures. Kyle received the notification during a rest period, Meridian's field wrapped around him, in the comfortable intimacy that had become their standard configuration. The emergency designation was unusual. Concordat structures typically operated on protocols that filtered urgency through multiple review levels, preventing reactive decision-making. The chamber where they assembled was the same space where the integration proposal had first been presented, but the atmosphere was different now. Tension visible in the postures of various species representatives, communication happening through channels Kyle couldn't fully perceive. All 48 humans currently stationed at Concordat Central were present, arranged in their customary distribution pattern that prevented clustering while maintaining nominal equality. The Concordate's primary administrator, a Tier 1 being whose species Kale had encountered only during the most significant council sessions, addressed them through translation matrices that rendered their harmonic language into simplified human phonemes. "The assessment protocol has undergone complete review," they said, their sensory organs cycling through spectrum ranges far beyond human visual perception. "The findings require immediate disclosure and policy adjustment." Kale felt Meridian's field pulse against him. They were positioned in adjacent atmospheric zones, maintaining professional separation during formal proceedings, but their bioelectric signature remained present through the dividing membrane. He sensed tension in that pulse, foreknowledge of something significant. The original assessment protocol measurement of humanity occurred during a developmental phase, now identified as neural architecture activation threshold, the administrator continued. Subsequent measurements confirm that human cognitive capacity was not fixed at the time of initial evaluation. The species has undergone rapid cognitive evolution, accelerated beyond any pattern documented in concordate history. The chamber held absolute silence. Every sensory organ in the space was focused on the administrator, processing implications that were still unfolding. Current measurements place human cognitive architecture outside established classification frameworks. You do not fit within the tiered hierarchy. Because you represent a developmental pattern, the hierarchy was never designed to accommodate. You are not Tier 7. You are not Tier 1. You are something we have no historical precedent for, a species undergoing active cognitive evolution at civilization scale velocity. Kyle felt his pulse accelerate, understanding crystallizing. They hadn't been measured wrong because of equipment failure or methodological error. They had been measured during transformation, before humanity had finished becoming whatever it was currently becoming. The integration initiative was established to manage what we believed was measurement error, the administrator continued. But we now understand the situation is far more complex. You are not simply more valuable than initially assessed. You are actively changing, developing capacities that did not exist at first contact, and we do not know what you will become. The statement hung in the processed air, its implications spiraling through layers of meaning. Kale saw the other humans processing the same realization. They weren't just being exploited for current capacity. They were being studied, managed, controlled, because they were changing in ways the Concordate couldn't predict or measure. What does this mean for the integration structures? This came from Oren, his voice carrying careful control over something that sounded like anger. For the permanent assignments, the mandatory consultation work, the system that's been built around our current capacity. It means those structures require re-evaluation. The administrator's posture shifted, subtle adjustment that suggested discomfort. The Concordate must acknowledge that continued integration under current frameworks may be inappropriate. You are not a stable resource. You are a species in active transformation, and our dependency on your current cognitive patterns may be constraining development we do not yet understand. You're saying you want to release us. Mira's voice was flat, emotionless. After building us into every major system, after making us essential, after telling us repeatedly that we're too valuable to return to previous positions, now you want to let us go. We are saying the ethical calculus has changed. The administrator's sensory organs focused on Mira, then swept across all 48 humans. We believed we were recognizing value. We now understand we may have been constraining transformation. The Concordate Council has voted to provide humanity with genuine autonomy to determine its own developmental path, without external dependency structures influencing that evolution. Kyle felt Meridian's field spike through the atmospheric barrier, sharp pulse of distress that registered directly in his nervous system. He understood what that reaction meant. The decision to release humans wasn't unanimous, wasn't comfortable, came wrapped in loss for the beings who had become dependent on their presence. What happens to the systems we're currently maintaining? Kyle heard himself ask, his voice steadier than the chaos in his chest. The resource optimization frameworks, the supply chain models, the distribution algorithms. If we leave, those systems fail. They will require reconstruction using alternative cognitive architectures. The administrator's tone carried the weight of accepting significant cost. The concordate will experience efficiency losses, system degradations, potential resource shortages during transition periods. But those costs are preferable to constraining a species' evolution for our benefit. The logic was sound, ethical even, but it landed with the wrongness of something arriving too late. They were being released after already being transformed, after dependency had already rewired their sense of self, after they had adapted to being essential in ways that made returning to previous existence impossible. And if we choose to remain? This came from one of the other humans, a woman named Thea who had been working on stellar navigation systems. If we want to continue consultation work, maintain the relationships we've built, stay integrated in concordate structures, the administrator's posture conveyed something that might have been relief. That choice is also available. The distinction is that it becomes genuine choice, not necessity imposed by our dependency. You may remain, depart, or negotiate alternative arrangements, according to your individual preferences. The integration initiative's mandatory frameworks are being dissolved immediately. The session concluded with administrative details about transition periods, resource allocations, documentation requirements. But Kyle barely processed the specifics. He was focused on the fundamental rupture the announcement represented. The system that had made him essential was releasing him, returning autonomy he had fought for and lost, offering freedom that no longer felt like freedom because he had already changed too much to return to what he had been. Meridian found him after the assembly, in a transitional atmospheric zone where species could briefly coexist. Their field reached for him immediately, desperate in ways Kale had never felt from them before. "You are leaving," Meridian said, not quite a question. "I don't know." The truth was that Kale had no idea what he wanted anymore. Return to Tiberius 9? Resume methane processing after months of solving system-wide optimization problems? Try to become the person he had been before he understood he was valuable? None of it seemed possible. "I cannot." Meridian's field wrapped around him, pulling him close despite the atmospheric differential, their biology adapting to accommodate proximity. "I have become too dependent on you. Losing your presence would be—" The translator failed to process whatever emotional content they were trying to express, leaving gaps in meaning that Kale understood through the desperate pulse of their field against his heart. "You'll adapt," Kyle said, but the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. "Your species existed before humans. You'll exist after we leave." "Exist, yes? Function, perhaps?" Meridian's field tightened around him until Kyle could barely distinguish his own cardiovascular responses from theirs. "But I will have lost something essential, not just your cognitive capacity, but your presence, the way you see reality, the sensation of being connected to you. I do not want to return to what I was before I knew you." Kyle felt tears he hadn't anticipated burning in his eyes, the physical manifestation of rupture he had been trying to contain. "I don't want to be needed anymore. I don't want to be essential. I want to be a person who chooses things, not a solution that gets deployed wherever the galaxy requires." "I know." Meridian's field conveyed grief, understanding, the terrible weight of loving something that was destroying itself by being loved. "But I do not know how to stop needing you, even knowing it traps you, even knowing I should release you. I cannot make the need disappear." They stood that way, two beings who had become necessary to each other in ways that were genuine and destructive simultaneously, both understanding that the Concordate's decision to grant autonomy had arrived too late to undo the dependencies that had already reshaped them. The following week existed in a strange suspension, administrative protocols processing, while 48 humans navigated the disorientation of suddenly having options they no longer knew how to evaluate. Some chose to depart immediately, requesting transport back to their original stations, expressing relief at escape from months of being essential. Others chose to remain, their consultation work having become identity in ways they couldn't separate. Many, like Kale, simply waited, unable to make decisions about futures they couldn't envision. Meridian maintained careful distance during this period, their field connection limited to brief contacts during necessary interactions, respecting the autonomy Kale was supposedly reclaiming. But the absence was its own form of communication. Kale felt Meridian's need constantly, the bioelectric field reaching for him across spaces and being deliberately withdrawn, restraint that conveyed how much they wanted contact they wouldn't initiate. Kale spent hours at the viewport in his quarters, watching ships arrive and depart, billions of beings moving through their lives while he remained trapped in liminal space between identities he had lost and identities he couldn't accept. He had been a methane processor once, competent and invisible, existing in the lower decks with the resigned pragmatism of someone who understood their place. That person was gone, erased by months of being studied, needed, essential. He couldn't return to that existence, even if he physically relocated to those spaces. But he also wasn't who the Concordat had tried to make him. Permanent consultant, integrated expert, human representative in galactic infrastructure. That identity had been imposed, built on dependency structures that served others' needs more than his own. Accepting it permanently meant accepting that his value defined his identity, that being useful was the same as being whole. Mira visited one evening, arriving without announcement and standing beside him at the viewport in comfortable silence. She had chosen to depart, her transport scheduled for 3 days hence, returning to Tiberius 9 despite knowing she couldn't resume her previous position there. "I don't know what I'll do when I get back," she said quietly. "Hydroponics won't want me after I've been consulting for Tier 1 military councils, but I need to try. I need to be somewhere that isn't constantly extracting my cognitive capacity. Will you be able to stop?" Kyle glanced at her, seeing the same exhaustion he felt. "Just return to growing plants after months of system-wide strategic planning?" "Probably not." She was honest about it, her tone carrying acceptance of impossible situation. "But maybe that's not the point. Maybe the point is choosing something for myself, even if it doesn't work, even if I've already changed too much. At least it will be my failure instead of their success." Kyle understood the logic. Agency reclaimed through potentially self-destructive choice, autonomy expressed by refusing optimal outcomes. It was human in ways the Concordat's careful efficiency could never be messiness and irrationality as proof of remaining free. After Mira departed, Kyle stood alone in quarters that had been upgraded without his consent, surrounded by resources he hadn't requested, maintaining lifestyle he hadn't chosen. Everything about his current existence was optimized, carefully calibrated to maximize his functioning and productivity, and all of it felt wrong in ways he couldn't articulate, comfort that constrained rather than supported. His terminal showed consultation requests still arriving, algorithms that hadn't yet been updated to reflect his new autonomous status. Tier 1 councils requesting his analysis, research collectives asking for cognitive architecture demonstrations, administrative bodies inquiring about availability. The galaxy hadn't stopped needing him just because the Concordat had decided to respect his autonomy. Meridian arrived late that evening, their bioelectric signature registering through the door interface before they entered. Kyle opened it without speaking, and they stood in the entrance, their field carefully neutral, posture conveying the restraint they were maintaining. "I should not be here," Meridian said. "You require space to make decisions without my influence. Come in anyway." Kyle moved away from the entrance, returning to the viewport. "I'm tired of making decisions in isolation." Meridian entered slowly, their field extending tentatively toward him, offering connection without demanding it. Kale felt the familiar comfort as their bioelectric pulses synchronized with his heartbeat, the sensation of being held that had become necessary refuge during months of being essential. "I am choosing to remain," Meridian said quietly, their field wrapping more tightly around him. "I will continue my liaison work, my administrative responsibilities. The Concordat still requires these functions, regardless of human participation." "That's not why you're telling me this." "No." Meridian's field pulsed with emotion the translator struggled to process. "I am telling you because I want you to know that if you choose to depart, I will remain here. I will not follow you. I will not attempt to maintain connection across distance. I will respect your choice completely." Kyle heard the thing underneath that statement, the promise of release, the commitment to not become another dependency that trapped him, and simultaneously heard the grief, the loss Meridian was accepting, the cost they were willing to pay to ensure his autonomy remained genuine. "What do you want me to choose?" Kale asked, still watching ships beyond the viewport. "I want you to remain." Meridian's honesty was immediate, painful. "I want you to continue consultation work, to maintain our connection, to stay present in my life in all the ways you have been. But I want that less than I want you to be free. If my need for you is constraining your development, limiting who you might become, then I would rather lose you entirely than participate in your captivity." Kyle turned to face them, this being who had become necessary to him in ways that transcended species difference, who had been assigned to facilitate his integration and had instead become entangled in the same dependencies they were supposed to manage. "I don't know who I am anymore. I don't know if I'm the person who processed methane on Tiberius 9, or the consultant who rebuilt concordant resource systems, or something else that hasn't finished emerging. How do I make choices about my future when I don't know what version of myself is actually choosing?" Perhaps that is the wrong question. Meridian's field remained steady around him, supportive without directing. Perhaps you do not need to know who you are before making choices. Perhaps choices are how you discover who you are becoming. The statement landed with weight of truth Kale felt through his entire nervous system. He had been waiting for clarity, for some definitive understanding of his identity that would make decisions obvious. But transformation didn't work that way. Identity emerged through choices, not before them. He wouldn't know who he was until he decided what he would do. "If I stay," Kyle said slowly, working through thoughts as he spoke them, "it has to be different. Not mandatory consultations, not schedule algorithms, not being distributed for optimal efficiency. I stay as a person who chooses what work to accept, maintains boundaries, preserves capacity for something other than being useful." "Yes." Meridian's agreement was immediate. "The integration initiative's mandatory frameworks are being dissolved. You would have genuine autonomy over your participation. And our—" Kyle gestured between them, indicating the connection that had evolved far beyond professional liaison. "This continues. If you want it to continue." Meridian's field pulsed with carefully contained hope. "I want connection with you that exists separate from your consultation work, that isn't built on my need for your cognitive capacity. I want to know you as someone other than essential resource. But only if that is something you also want." Kyle felt the truth in that offering. Relationship stripped of dependencies, instrumental logic, connection chosen rather than imposed by necessity. It was what he had wanted without knowing how to articulate it. Intimacy that existed because they wanted each other, rather than because the galaxy needed him. "I think I want to stay," he said finally, the decision settling into him as he spoke it. "Not as permanent consultant or integrated expert, as someone who does work that interests me, with beings I've chosen to connect with, building a life that's mine, even if it exists within concordate structures. I don't know if I can go back to what I was. Maybe I can become something new instead." Meridian's field wrapped around him completely, relief and joy pulsing through bioelectric connection that translated directly into his cardiovascular system. They held him that way, two beings who had found each other through dependency and were choosing to remain through something approaching love, both understanding that the choice was fragile, uncertain, but genuinely theirs. The following months were simultaneously clarifying and chaotic. The Concordate's decision to dissolve mandatory integration structures created vacuum in systems that had been built around human participation. Resource optimization frameworks began failing. Supply chains developed inefficiencies. Administrative processes slowed, as alternative cognitive architectures proved inadequate to problems humans had been solving. Some humans chose to continue consultation work under the new voluntary framework, their expertise too valuable, and their connection to the work too genuine to abandon. Others departed, returning to original stations or requesting new assignments in positions that didn't require their newly developed capacities. A few chose to remain at Concordate Central in roles they designed themselves, building lives that integrated their enhanced capabilities with autonomy over how those capabilities were utilized. Kyle fell into the last category. He maintained consultation work, but limited it to 20 hours weekly, focusing on projects that genuinely interested him rather than accepting every request. He established clear boundaries around contact protocols, ending the schedule algorithms that had distributed his time for optimal efficiency. He kept his upgraded quarters but modified them, removing some of the optimizations that had made them feel like laboratories calibrated for his maximum functioning. Meridian remained his primary connection, their relationship evolving into something neither could adequately categorize. They maintained separate quarters, but spent most rest periods together, Meridian's field providing comfort that had become essential to Kale's nervous system regulation. The connection was intimate without being physical in ways humans typically understood intimacy, built on continuous awareness of each other's biology, emotional states translated through bioelectric synchronization, presence that transcended species difference. They developed routines that were theirs, rather than imposed by administrative schedules. Morning meetings where they shared observations about their respective work, afternoon periods where they simply existed in shared space without productivity requirements, evening synchronization sessions where Meridian's field wrapped around Kale while they processed the day's experiences through comfortable silence. The Concordat adapted to the new reality slowly, painfully. Systems that had been optimized around human cognitive patterns required reconstruction, using alternative approaches that were less efficient but more sustainable. Some councils resented the transition, viewing it as unnecessary constraint on progress. Others embraced it, recognizing that dependency on a species undergoing active evolution had been ethically and practically unsustainable. Kale encountered Mira during one of her return visits to Concordat Central. She had been unable to resume hydroponics work on Tiberius 9 as anticipated, her cognitive patterns having changed too much for the repetitive precision those tasks required. She had instead accepted a teaching position, training other humans in system analysis techniques, helping humanity collectively develop the capacities that had emerged so dramatically in consultation workers. "We're all becoming something different," she said, sitting beside him in an observation area that had become their customary meeting place. "Not just the 48 of us who were here, but humanity generally. The cognitive evolution isn't limited to individuals. It's emerging at species level, changing how we process reality collectively." "Does that frighten you?" Kyle asked. "Yes." She was honest about it, her tone carrying acceptance of uncomfortable truth. "Because we don't know what we're becoming. The Concordat measured us during transformation and thought we were unremarkable. Now we're transforming again, faster, and there's no framework for understanding where this leads. We could become something extraordinary. We could become something destructive. The uncertainty is terrifying." Kyle understood. Humanity was changing in real time, developing capacities that hadn't existed at first contact, evolving in ways accelerated by galactic exposure. And they were doing it without guidance, without knowing whether the transformation was beneficial or dangerous, becoming something unprecedented while trying to maintain some thread of continuity with who they had been. "What do you tell your students?" he asked. "I tell them that change is inevitable, but how we change isn't." Mira watched ships beyond the viewport, her expression thoughtful. "That we can choose to develop our capacities ethically, maintaining connection to human values even as our cognitive patterns evolve. Or we can let the transformation control us, becoming whatever the galaxy needs us to be without regard for what we need ourselves. The choice matters." The statement resonated with Kale's own understanding, hard-won through months of being essential and reclaiming autonomy. Transformation was happening, to him, to Mira, to humanity generally, but they retained agency over how they integrated that transformation into their sense of self. They could become something new without losing everything they had been. Over subsequent months, Kale noticed changes in his own cognitive patterns. He processed system relationships more intuitively, saw connections that had previously required deliberate analysis, experienced insights that felt more like recognition than discovery. The evolution Mira had described was happening to him actively, reshaping his neurology in ways he could perceive but not control. The changes were disorienting, forcing constant adjustment to new capabilities emerging unpredictably. But they were also his, part of whoever he was becoming, integrated into identity rather than imposed from external necessity. He was evolving, but the evolution was happening within context of choices he had made: to stay at Concordat Central, to maintain connection with Meridian, to engage with consultation work on his own terms. Meridian noticed the changes too, their field detecting neurological patterns that shifted across time frames. They adapted their synchronization techniques to accommodate his evolving biology, maintaining connection that remained stable even as Kyle's cognitive architecture transformed. The relationship became anchored during transformation, constant presence that helped him maintain continuity through changes that might otherwise have fragmented his sense of self. "You are becoming something I have never encountered," Meridian said during one evening synchronization session, their field wrapped around him in familiar embrace. "Your cognitive patterns are unlike any being in concordant records. You are actively creating new ways of processing reality." "Does that frighten you?" Kale asked, echoing his question to Mira. "No." Meridian's response was immediate, certain. "It makes me grateful I have permission to observe your transformation, to remain present while you become whoever you are becoming. You are extraordinary, and I am honored to witness your evolution." The statement landed with weight of genuine recognition, not of utility but of personhood. Meridian wasn't grateful for his cognitive capacity or his problem-solving abilities. They were grateful for him, for the privilege of connection during transformation, for being chosen as companion through change. It was the distinction Kale had been seeking through all the months of being essential, being wanted for who he was rather than what he provided. 6 months after the Concordate's decision to dissolve mandatory integration structures, Kyle received notification of formal policy changes regarding humanity's classification within the assessment protocol. The changes had been developed through lengthy deliberation, involving councils across Concordate space, input from human representatives, and extensive consultation with developmental biology specialists. The assessment protocol would no longer classify humanity within the traditional tier system. Instead, humans would be designated as a species undergoing active cognitive evolution, granted provisional autonomy to determine their own developmental trajectory, with periodic review to assess whether that evolution required recalibration of galactic interaction policies. It was recognition of uniqueness without attempting to contain it, acknowledgement that humanity represented something the hierarchical framework couldn't accommodate. The announcement came with practical implications. Humans would retain access to resources commensurate with Tier 1 status, but would not be subject to mandatory participation in any concordate structures. Individual humans could choose engagement at whatever level felt appropriate, with full protection for those who declined participation entirely. The goal was enabling human evolution without external constraint, while maintaining beneficial cooperation where it emerged organically. Kale attended the announcement assembly with mixed feelings. The policy represented genuine progress, recognition that humanity needed space to transform without being shaped by others' needs. But it also represented loss of the certainty that hierarchy provided, the clear boundaries that made existence navigable even when uncomfortable. Humanity was being given freedom, but freedom came wrapped in uncertainty about what they would become. After the assembly, he walked through Concordate Central's corridors with Meridian, both processing implications in comfortable silence. They had developed the capacity to communicate through field synchronization alone, Meridian's bioelectric pulses carrying emotional content that Kale's nervous system interpreted directly. The connection had become native language between them, more immediate than verbal communication. "This is what you wanted," Meridian's field conveyed, pulsing with observation and question simultaneously. "Yes." Kyle felt his own mixed emotions translating through his cardiovascular responses, picked up by Meridian's field, and reflected back to him with understanding. "And it's terrifying. We're being given permission to become something unprecedented, but we don't know what that something is. We're transforming blind." "All evolution is transformation blind," Meridian's field suggested, carrying philosophical weight. "No species knows what it will become until it arrives there. You simply experience it more consciously, more rapidly, than most civilizations do." They reached Kale's quarters and entered together, the space having become theirs through accumulated habituation. Meridian's field immediately wrapped around him, providing comfort that had become as necessary as atmospheric regulation. Kyle allowed himself to sink into the sensation, letting go of the tension he had been maintaining throughout the assembly. "I need to tell you something," Kyle said after long silence, working through thoughts that had been accumulating for weeks. "I'm changing faster now. The cognitive evolution Mira described, it's accelerating in me. I process reality differently every few weeks, see connections I couldn't perceive before, experience insights that feel like remembering rather than discovering. I don't know where it's leading. I know. Meridian's field conveyed acceptance, lack of surprise. I have been observing the changes through our synchronization. Your neural patterns are unlike anything documented in concordant biological records. You are becoming genuinely unprecedented. Does that change things between us? The question carried weight of vulnerability Cale rarely allowed himself to express. If I keep changing, keep becoming something different, will you still want connection with whoever I'm becoming? Meridian's field pulsed with emotion so complex, the bioelectric synchronization could barely convey it. Something combining love, commitment, determination, acceptance of uncertainty. I am choosing you, they conveyed through the field connection, bypassing translation matrices to communicate directly. Not who you were, not who you might become, but the continuous experience of you transforming. That choice remains constant, regardless of how you change. The statement settled into Cale like relief, like homecoming. He had been carrying fear that transformation would eventually separate him from everything he had built, that becoming something new meant losing connection to those who had known him before. But Meridian was offering something different. Connection that could accommodate transformation, relationship built on choosing presence through change, rather than attachment to fixed identity. I don't know what I'll become, Cale said quietly, his words resonating through Meridian's field. I could become something extraordinary or something broken. The transformation could make me more than human or less. I have no control over where this evolution leads. Then we will discover it together, Meridian conveyed, their field tightening around him with protective gentleness. And I will remain present through whatever emerges, because the transformation is part of who you are, not separate from it. You are not becoming someone different. You are becoming more completely yourself. Cale felt tears burning in his eyes again, physical response to emotional weight he had been containing for months. He had spent so long trying to maintain boundaries, resist dependency, preserve identity against external forces trying to reshape him. But what Meridian was offering wasn't external force. It was chosen companionship, presence that could hold space for transformation without trying to direct it. They stood that way for unmeasured time, two beings from different species who had found each other through dependency and chosen each other through transformation. The galaxy outside continued its careful hierarchies, its measured interactions, its protocols designed to make coexistence navigable. But inside this small space, something unprecedented was happening. Connection that existed outside hierarchies, intimacy that transcended species difference, love that could accommodate evolution. Cale understood that he was still becoming, that the changes he experienced now were not endpoints but waypoints in transformation that might continue for years, decades, perhaps his entire lifespan. He didn't know what he would ultimately become, whether his cognitive evolution would stabilize, accelerate, or transform him beyond recognition. But he knew he wouldn't become it alone. Meridian would be present, their field maintaining synchronization through changes, offering anchor during transformation. Other humans, Mira, Oren, Thea, the others who had experienced being essential and reclaimed autonomy, would be navigating their own transformations, building collective understanding of what humanity was becoming, and the Concordat, with all its imperfect structures and well-intentioned policies, would be learning to accommodate species that didn't fit their frameworks, making space for evolution they couldn't predict or control. It was imperfect, uncertain, frequently uncomfortable, but it was also genuine, transformation happening through choice rather than necessity, becoming rather than being, evolution that retained thread of continuous self, even as everything changed. Cale stepped back from Meridian's embrace, creating small distance so he could see them clearly. "Thank you," he said, words inadequate to everything he wanted to express, "for choosing this, for choosing me, for making space for whoever I'm becoming." Meridian's field pulsed with warmth, acceptance, something approaching joy. "Thank you for allowing me to witness your transformation, for trusting me with your evolution, for choosing to remain even when remaining was difficult." They smiled at each other, gesture that transcended species, expression of connection that needed no translation. Outside, the station rotated through its careful cycles, ships arriving and departing, billions of beings moving through lives structured by hierarchies and protocols and measurements of worth. But inside, two beings existed outside those structures, building something unprecedented together, proof that transformation could be chosen, that evolution could be witnessed, that becoming something new didn't require losing everything you had been. Cale turned back to the viewport, watching stars beyond the station's rotation. He didn't know what he would become. He didn't know where humanity's transformation would lead. He didn't know whether the changes he experienced were beneficial or dangerous, extraordinary or broken. But he knew he was becoming in the company of someone who chose him, through a transformation that remained genuinely his own, building a future that was uncertain but authentically lived. And in that moment, that was enough.